Hello, hello, and thanks for tuning in. Welcome to episode 2 of Decoding the Unicorn, the podcast. In today's episode, I will talk about introverts and management, the hidden strength of quiet leaders. So let's think for a moment about the word leader. What image comes to mind? Is it some bold, loud, brassy, sassy, so-called charismatic figure who commands the room? Maybe it's someone with a loud, booming voice, always in the spotlight. But what if I told you that some of history's greatest leaders were actually quiet, introspective, and deeply reflective? Today, I want to break down the myth that leaders have to be loud in order to be effective. And I will explore how introverts, like Dag Hammarskjöld, led with quiet strength and deep impact. I'll also dive into some of the science behind introverted leadership, how to embrace your own natural strengths, and how to thrive in a world that often puts a premium on extroversion. I know this topic well, not only because of my kindred spiritship with Dag and my intimate study of him, but also because I'm an introvert myself. I'm an INFJ if you follow the Myers-Briggs scale, and I'm also an HSP. I know what it's like to not fit in. I know definitely what it's like to feel like a left foot stuck in a right shoe, trying to make do as best you can in the corporate world and feeling miserable. So if you have ever felt like you don't fit the traditional leadership mold, this episode is for you. We're going to debunk myths, highlight real world examples, and give actionable strategies to help you embrace your own leadership potential. So with that said, let's dive in. First and foremost, why do we assume that in order for a person to be a leader, they also have to be loud and bold and kind of jazz hands? Society, in particular, I would say Western world society, equates confidence with volume, but that's not always accurate. And conversely, they tend to think that if someone is maybe a little quieter, a little bit more reserved, that person must be shy. They must not be very bold. They must be very milquetoast and wimpy, timid even. We have this idea of the so-called charismatic leader who we glorify in leadership, as well as I would say in Hollywood and acting and in rock stars and in the music world. But this can be misleading. Here's how an example of this bias plays out in business and politics, as well as just everyday life. You have the idea that loud volume also equates things like passion, enthusiasm, commitment to the job, and even more frighteningly, sometimes people equate the idea of loud volume with a person's competence level. This couldn't be further from the truth. Superficial charisma and looks and the jazz hands and all of this, that fades. It's substance that actually lasts. I think it was in the last episode where I talked about how Dag himself made the comparison of circus performers, acrobats, and the lion tamers and the tightrope walkers. They ooh and ah and wow an audience while they're doing what they do. But it's a patient builder who actually has long-term successful construction. And I think, unfortunately, especially in the age of social media, what the podcaster David Barrett calls fast society. Like he had a podcast episode recently where he talked about how our mind has the tendency to be fast and cold. Whereas when we start getting into more of the spirit, it tends to be warm and slow. There's a lot to be said for that concept. The flash and the ooh and the ah, all of that fades. But when we're in a space of contemplation and real introspection and reflection, we can build something that will really last. And this is where introverts and HSPs have a true advantage because they get into thinking with depth, really considering options and looking at the big picture, the long-term strategy. Cultural perceptions of leadership may differ. Some cultures will value introverted leadership more than others, which is why I typically tend to really say Western world is focused on extroversion. I would ask you, have you ever felt overlooked because you weren't the loudest person in the room? If so, believe me, you're not alone. I've said many times that I sat through, I don't even know how many meetings in the corporate world where the loudest extrovert was the person who won the day. And typically, that would also be an extroverted male. If someone was more thoughtful, a little bit more reticent, they wanted to have the opportunity to turn the Rubik's Cube around in their mind before they just popped out an answer, whoever was this loud, boisterous, forceful, domineering male would really command everyone's attention in the room and therefore get everybody diverted to go his way. Well, very often that wasn't the way that was the best way. Sometimes it was like the proverbial Acme dynamite kit that would blow up in the person's face. Let's also think about how quiet leadership, like Dag Hammarskjöld's, creates deep and lasting impact. Dag is such a great example for this because his introversion and his tendency to be a highly sensitive person did not mean that he was not deeply effective. We tend to say things like, this person was quiet, but they were also brave. Despite this person's introversion, they did this and that. They were a world leader or they excelled at public speaking. And it's like, please stop. Please just stop saying things like that. A person can be quiet, brave, and bold. It's not that introverts are incapable of public speaking. And it's not that introverts are incapable of being in a social gathering. We need to get over these ridiculous stereotypes. Dag's leadership style was marked by things like thoughtful decision-making, not ready, fire, aim, but ready, aim, fire. Let's really think about what we're doing and look at all of the different possibilities, good, bad, or indifferent, that could come from this one decision. Diplomatic finesse. As I talk about in Decoding the Unicorn, Dag had to navigate a lot of complicated situations, people of different cultures, of different languages, of different traditions. And he didn't go in with the type of attitude that we see lampooned in the book, The Ugly American. That book is incredible. I actually don't recommend the film version that was made. I love Brando's acting, but that was not a film that I would recommend him in, especially after you read the book. If you go and watch the movie adaptation that was made a few years later, you're like, oh my God, what the what? But the book is incredible. And it really talks about how during the Cold War, there was this perception that the Soviets were winning the kind of diplomatic side of the Cold War, because their attachés and their ambassadors and their personnel that would get dispatched to other countries actually cared about immersion. They would learn the language, they would eat the food. They wouldn't just all hang out with other Soviet expats, they would hang out with people in the community. They understood local culture, traditions, religious observations, etc. Whereas the Americans were really focused on hanging out with other American expats. They only wanted to speak English. They wanted to drink American beer and eat hamburgers. And it was like, we don't want to assimilate. We don't want to learn the language here. We just expect everybody to speak English to us and to eat our food. And we'll only shop at the commissary and we're just going to kind of do our own thing. Dag wasn't like that. He was practicing cultural sensitivity long before that became a buzzword term. He also operated with emotional intelligence. Yes, book smarts and brain logic intelligence is important, but so is emotional intelligence as well. Being able to read the room and figure out what's going on. In fact, even to just be a pragmatic diplomat, you have to be able to read the room and figure out what's actually going to happen here. If I bring these people together, how best can I facilitate peace talks? It's not about I'm going to force my agenda down somebody else's throat. It's how can I be a good facilitator of what needs to happen here in order for, World War III to not break out. He also prioritized service and duty over ego. This was really something that was instilled in him from early on, from childhood even, because his father Hjalmar was very like, the Hammarskjöld legacy is we are public servants. We go into civil service. We go into government work. It's not about exaltation of the self. It's about what can we do for other human beings on planet Earth. And there are a lot of biographers, well, not a lot because Dag's not super well known, but there have been plenty of people who have sort of cast Dag as being a lot like his mother. Like, oh, there was the side of him that was poetic and that loved art like his mother did. And it's like, oh, there were things from his father's side that seeped in too. And Dag himself admitted that in his essay for this, I believe. He was very clear in saying, here's what I inherited from my father's side of the family, and here's what I think I inherited from my mother's side of the family. So Dag was very self-aware of the traits that helped to make him him. So we contrast these things like the thoughtful decision making, the diplomatic finesse, the cultural sensitivity, the emotional intelligence, the service over ego. And then we look at a lot of modern leaders that seem to be caught up in braggadocio and bombast and threats. It's like leadership by threat, leadership by, if you don't do what we're telling you to do, we will just bomb your country. And I'm like, who wants that? Who outside of the warmongers who profiteer ruthlessly from the nation going to war, who in the hell wants that? It's just mind-blowing to me. Dag's introversion made him stronger, not weaker. It's not a detriment to someone's personality to be an introvert or an HSP, and we need to move away from that line of thinking that it's a defect of some kind. Introverts often see what others miss, which leads to long-term decision-making. That power of observation is something that Dag had very much of, and it served him well, not only when he became UN Secretary General, but also in his government position in Sweden. For example, at a time of high unemployment, when the Swedish economy was not doing so well, Dag was appointed to really take the bull by the horns, so to speak, and turn the situation around, which he did. That doesn't happen by somebody saying, I'm going to force a square peg into a round hole. It's my way or the highway. That also requires the power of observation, being able to look around at how people are suffering and figure out what is the best way to solve this problem. Now, there is some science behind introverted leadership. Studies have shown that introverts often are better listeners, planners, and decision makers. I would highly, highly, highly recommend, if for some reason you have not already read Susan Cain's amazing book, Quiet, I would highly recommend that you do, because she has a number of studies highlighted in her book about the power of introversion. One of them that sticks in my mind all the time is this study about groupthink. You herd everybody into a room and you sort of put this pressure on them, like everybody needs to come to the same conclusion, everybody needs to think the same way. And it's like the environment that cults have. And I see that so many times in the corporate world. You must be one of us. You must think the way that we do. We're going to all have a brainstorming session and we're going to tell you that no idea is a bad idea, but really we want everybody to agree with what the manager says to do. And it's like, this is ghastly. You can also check out Adam Grant and his work online. He has a lot of good information as well about introverts versus extroverts in leadership. Introverts tend to process before reacting, right? So again, we're out of the ready, fire, aim and into the ready, aim, fire, as opposed to just zipping into something without knowing what you're really doing. This leads to better long-term strategies, better long-term outcomes. There's also more of a tendency to lead with humility, which leads to actually more team-oriented leadership. And this is another area that I think Dag excelled in. He started coffee hours or coffee clatches at the UN, where people could come in, have coffee and a donut, and there was no fear of reprisal. If you wanted to make a complaint, if you wanted to identify a bottleneck, if you wanted to give somebody a compliment or talk about how a process could be improved, or even if you just wanted to have a solid hang and sit and drink coffee and eat some free pastries in the corner while you listen to everybody else, you could do that. And it really helped morale. And also, anytime that Dag addressed his staff, it was always us. It was always we. And it was always in a thankful way, not like we're screwing it up, we're doing it wrong. If something went wrong, Dag took the blame himself and said, I screwed this up. I messed this up. But anytime there was a win, it was we all did this together. And that inspires so much passion and so much loyalty amongst staff. There's also the tendency to be deeply self-reflective, which in turn leads to more ethical and principled leadership. Obviously, we see this if you read Dag's book, Markings, which I really hope you'll do. You see the way that he not only was introspective, but it was like he really wanted to understand what made him tick. And in so doing, he started to better understand the human condition, because when we look inward, and Dag had a fabulous speech about this. I talk about it in Decoding the Unicorn. The more that we look inward, we realize that the road inward actually leads back out. And so it becomes like an infinity loop. I learn more about me, why I feel the way that I do, why I think the way that I do. And then that in turn helps me to better understand you. Why are you thinking that way? Why are you approaching it that way? So even though people may sort of, pejoratively say it's just navel gazing, get out of your own head. Yeah, there are times when you should get out of your own head and go help another human being, which Dag did. At the same time, if you're never exploring the inner workings up there, that can be a major problem. And this goes back to what David Baer was saying about everything being cold and fast. I want to pick up a smartphone and immediately be connected to the internet and start scrolling, just start mindlessly scrolling on social media. And as he said in one of his podcasts recently, it's like people will put the phone down and then 5 minutes later, if that, they're back on it again, scrolling again, wanting that dopamine hit. I was watching a rerun of Shark Tank recently, and I think it was Mark Cuban. I can't remember if it was Robert Herjavec or Mark Cuban, but I think it was Mark, who said, we're in an on-demand economy. People want what they want when they want it, which is right damn now. And it's like, you better preach. That's exactly right. So when somebody wants to say, like, wait a minute, let's stop, let's have a pause, let's take a breath, let's not make this decision right damn now, let's think about it, let's be artful. Sometimes that's met with hostility. If somebody says, I need to take a good 10 to 15 minutes to just go meditate and go within, sometimes that's met with hostility because people want what they want, which is right damn now. There is also some science behind some science behind energy management, like how social energy depletion affects introverts and extroverts differently, how to work with that as opposed to working against it. And I really think that, when we look at things like co-working spaces and hot desking and open office plans, having all that noise and chatter and never having an escape, or having one of those offices where a person has to go in a phone booth, a little weird closet in order to have 10 minutes of privacy, or in order to make a phone call to, make an appointment with the doctor or talk about some test result that they don't want the whole office to know about. It's like, no. People deserve a modicum of privacy, and they deserve to hear their own thoughts at work. Not everybody wants that boisterous, loud, let's all be together, let's be together all day long, cult-like environment. So if you are an introvert, if you're an HSP, and the things that I'm talking about in this episode are really resonating with you, and you're sitting there in your car or listening to me while you're on the treadmill and you're like, oh my God, yes, please preach. Many introverts feel pressure to fake a sense of extroversion in order to succeed in leadership roles. I can't tell you how many times in my career that I was told, no, you don't have to go to Billy Bob's barbecue on Saturday, but it would really look good if you did. No, you don't have to hang out at the coffee pot. You don't have to hang out at the water cooler, but we really think you should. If you want to be considered for management, you have to be more sociable. And I remember a passage in markings I highlighted probably about 5 times was where Dag was talking about how much he loathed the word sociable. Like, why can't people ever just chill? Be alone with themselves, be alone with their own thoughts. Why are we measuring human beings by their ability to be sociable? It's like, yeah, why do we do that? It's absurd. So there's a difference between a small situational adaptation versus wildly abandoning who you are. I would say if we want to look at practical tips, number 1, lean into your strengths. And you know what? That comes from knowing thyself, being able to go within and really take a look at the inner workings in there. If you're awesome at things like listening and deep thinking and written communication as opposed to off the cuff extemporaneous speaking, if you're better as a strategic planner, lean into those things. You might not want to take a job in a highly extroverted environment where it's open office, it's hot desking, and they want answers immediately and nothing's ever in writing, and they want you on Slack so they can surveil you. That may just not be a workplace that you want to even dip your toe in. The second thing I would say is play the long game, which introverts are typically so good at doing. I would definitely say that's one of my introvert strengths. I have for years had very good foresight, very good forethought, anytime when I was involved in staffing and recruiting, anytime that I would make job market predictions, they always came true because I could just see the ebbs and flows. I knew exactly what I was looking at. Introverts tend to thrive in more structured and deep work. And sometimes it's not always necessarily structured as long as it's deep, as long as we feel like there's some sense of meaning to it. So don't be afraid to play the long game and really think about the environment that you're in. Is it suited to you and where is it going? Also, thirdly, find leadership styles that do work for you so that you feel authentic and you're not having to put on this mask. I saw a video recently. I cannot even remember the woman's name, but I saw a video recently on YouTube where this woman was talking about how nowadays there's a so-called cult of authenticity. And she was talking about why, in her opinion, it was good to just be fake. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute. First of all, gross. Secondly, I do get that not everybody needs to see the most private version of you. You know, I'm sitting here in a shirt and a sweater. I'm not sitting here with my clothing off. I've combed my hair. I've put on some makeup. Like, not everybody needs to see, let's say you're on camera and you're like, I don't really feel comfortable with being without my makeup. I want to have on a little bit of a social face before I go on. That's perfectly fine. And I would say that's a situational, like, it's not that I'm wearing a mask necessarily. It's just a situational, hey, I'm going to be a little bit more presentable, what I would consider to be presentable. I'm going to be a little bit more extroverted than I normally would be. You know, normally I might have my hair tucked up in a hat and I'd be in one of my farm t-shirts and I couldn't care less about whether or not I had a stitch of makeup on. But I do think you have to be able to lead with some degree of authenticity, because if you are walking around 40 hours plus, you know, a lot of people typically nowadays will work 50, 60 hours a week. If you're walking around that many hours out of the week feeling fake, not being yourself, it wears on you. Don't let anybody tell you that it doesn't, because it does. So when I hear things like the lady in the YouTube video going, well, there's a cult of authenticity and you should just be more fake, I'm like, according to who? Like, do you not like yourself? Are you like projecting your own stuff onto everybody else? Because I'm cool with who I am. I don't feel like I need to go around and fake it and be somebody different than I am. Right? So find leadership styles that work for you where you feel comfortable in your own skin. And then fourth, I would say set boundaries for your own energy management. Avoid burnout. It can happen so easily when we step into leadership roles. There's always demands on our time. There's always a person that has one more question, whether it's a client, whether it's an employee. So make sure that you don't throw yourself into workaholism. I'm much better about that now than I used to be. I call myself recovering type A. There are still moments when that little type A gremlin in my head starts pecking at me and annoying me, but I am better about it. Dag really gave himself over to workaholism a lot. You don't have to. Avoid burnout. We are human beings, not human doings. You don't have to go, go, go every 5 minutes. I would also say that we can dispel this mythology around networking. Introverts don't have to work the room and schmooze everybody in order to be a successful leader. And thank God for that. I can remember in my first iteration of self-employment when people were like, well, you should just go to networking events, go to Chamber of Commerce events, go to these networking breakfasts. And they were just, God help me, I'm not trying to offend anybody, but they were such colossal wastes of time, because the people who would show up to a coffee shop or a Panera Bread at 7 a.m. to hang out in the back room, they were all salespeople desperate for sales that just wanted to all sling business cards around. And they all hoped that an actual real client with money to spend would show up, and it never happened. And it's like, because clients with money to spend are not hanging out at Panera at 7 a.m. in a back room looking desperate. I mean, think about it. We don't always have to get into these garish networking situations in order to be successful at sales or successful at leadership, either one. And I would also say that there's a real power in gaining confidence in public speaking. It's not that introversion automatically means that you're a poor public speaker. There are extroverts who have terrible stage fright. I think that regardless, introvert, extrovert, ambivert, if you can get more comfortable with speaking to other people, small groups, large groups, whatever, that's only going to help you in your leadership career. And even if that's something like content creation, being able to get on a video and say, all right, in times past, I would have just gone audio only because I'm not super duper comfortable doing this, but I'm going to go ahead and push my comfort zone out. Not because anybody's telling me I have to do that. Nobody's like holding a weapon on me like you had better record this video. I'm doing it because I feel like there's importance to it. And as I've said before, I'll do things for Dag that I wouldn't do for myself. So sometimes we have to just say, all right, I'm going to feel the fear and do it anyway. I'm going to get more comfortable with this. And in addition to just public speaking in general, I would also say that the more you can learn how to do some extemporaneous speaking, I'm not saying like all of the communication that you do should be off the cuff and on the fly, but if you can do some of that, it will help. If everything that you do has to be scripted, if you can't ever go off script and then go back again without getting super nervous, work on that. Not because I'm saying to do it, but just let it soak in a little bit. Think about whether or not that would help you in your career, whether you want to be an entrepreneur, you want to start your own business, you want to manage people at work, maybe be an intrapreneur. Think about whether or not that ability would be helpful. Not to fundamentally change who you are, start altering your DNA, just to add a little bit of spice, a little bit extra to what you already have to offer. Would it be helpful to you? So last but not least, I want to look at how to find that right balance, when to speak up, when to lead through action, when to retreat a little bit. Introverts don't need to be silent in order to be effective, in the same way that we don't need to be jazz hands and crazy and loud and like we're shouting at everybody through a bullhorn. We also don't have to be silent as the tomb. There's a real emotional intelligence and depth to knowing when to use your voice, when to lead through quiet action, like, lead by example, show, don't tell, and when to just hush. When we think about like fight, flight, or freeze, sometimes freezing is actually the best choice of the three. Sometimes it's not, but sometimes it is. I also would think about the Craig Ferguson rule. Whenever he is thinking about opening his mouth, he looks at this triad of questions. Does this need to be said? Does this need to be said right now? Does this need to be said right now by me specifically? If he cannot answer yes, he shuts up. There is a lot of power in that. Not everything that you think up here needs to come out of your mouth. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes it needs to go through a little bit of filtering, needs to get cleaned up a little bit before it leaves your mouth. Just know the difference. Know when it's time to lead by example, when it's time to speak up, and when it's time to just hush. Dag's a great example here, yet again, because he wasn't the loudest person in the room. When he spoke, people listened. He liked to eat, for example, in the UN cafeteria. There's this idea that because he came from a somewhat aristocratic family and he lived in a castle, an actual, real, literal castle when he was a kid. He was multilingual. He had a fantastic education. He had multiple degrees, including a PhD. As Edward Lewis says in Pretty Woman, I went all the way through school, so did Dag. There's this idea that he must have been this very upper crust snob. And unless everything was just very fa-fa and very she, he wasn't interested. And that's not true. He liked to go to the UN cafeteria. He liked to hear the scuttlebutt. He liked to find out what was going on. He liked to just hang out and listen, have a bowl of beef stew and chill. And there's a lot of like approachability that comes from that and a lot of relatability too. You figure out as a leader what's going on with your people when you can just sit back and observe. Dag also led through service, wisdom, and quiet confidence. Again, we're not talking about forcing. We're not talking about yelling and stomping and threatening. A good leader should not have to act like a dictator or a tyrant. So if that's you right now, if you're acting like Lord and Master over your team, you need to consider what's going on with you. What's going on that you feel the need to be doing that? Introverts absolutely can master the art of impactful communication. It's not fair to say that an introvert is never going to be able to do that, just like it's not fair to say that an extrovert automatically has a leg up. You can talk and talk and talk and never come to an actual point. As a college professor once told me, an empty can is the one that makes the most noise. I think we also have to look at strategic speaking, how to prepare and deliver powerful messages as an introverted leader or as any kind of leader. Think about what you're actually saying. Who is the audience and what do you want to communicate to them so that you're not just talking or taking gigs to have gigs. I've talked before about how whenever I released Decoding the Unicorn, I was like, okay, I think I'm going to have to do like a poor man's press junket. And I was making these appointments and I was trying to get exposure. And I just realized like, this is not, no, just no, stop, no, reset, no. Not all exposure is good exposure. Not all invitations are invitations that you need to accept. Your time is valuable. Your energy is valuable. And I think as introverts, we really understand that better. It's more intuitive to us that if I have to get on an airplane and fly somewhere, or I have to get on a Zoom call and I've got to be on for all this period of time and I have to look a certain way and I have to perform, I have to be, stage mode. I want to really make sure that I'm conveying to the audience what I want to convey and somebody's getting something out of it. If I make an appearance, it gets 20 views on YouTube and then it fades into obscurity. Was that worth my time? I can't make that decision for you. I'm just going to say for me personally, the answer would be no. I don't want to reach 20 people. I would really prefer to reach 200 and then 400 and then 800 and so on and build from there. We all have to start small. I get that. Very few people are catapulted into so-called overnight success. All I'm saying here is that it is okay to be strategic with your time and your energy. In terms of navigating those workplace dynamics, you can avoid being overshadowed by the more outspoken colleagues and stay true to your authentic self. And one of the ways to do that is to really have better ideas, to think about how to build a better mousetrap, how to solve the problem. People don't care about a laundry list of your credentials. They want to know how you're going to solve their problem. If they have a headache, they want to know that you're a pain reliever. They don't want you to stand there and say, well, I'm a doctor with 15 years of experience and I've worked at such and so hospital and I was voted best doctor in the tri-state area 5 times running. I got a headache, pal. What are you doing for me? Sometimes it can just be as simple as, do you have the superior idea? And then also, can you communicate that? Not in a way that's arrogant and over the top, but just, hey, look, I've built a better mousetrap and I want to tell you why. So here's a good takeaway, I think, bringing this episode home. Leadership is not about volume. It's about impact. I personally believe that the world needs more thoughtful, ethical, and introspective leaders. If you're an introvert or an HSP, you already have the tools to lead, just like Dag did. You don't have to fundamentally change who you are or try to fake everything. I would encourage you to reflect on your own strengths as a quiet leader. If you've never contemplated it before, go into that contemplative, meditative space. Maybe get out a pen and paper and write them down. What do I feel that I bring to the table as an introvert or HSP leader that's different from my peers? Share those thoughts and experiences. If you're not comfortable with broadcasting them to the world, maybe you just talk to your best friend or your spouse. Maybe you even just talk. Hold on, let me get Theodore. Maybe you just talk to a buddy and say, hi, Teddy. I feel like I'm very good at being able to see the long game, play the long game, see the big picture. I feel like that's my strength. Oh, that's great. So introverts, I feel like this is a good moment. This is a good moment in time for us. You don't have to change who you are to be an effective leader. You really have everything that you already need. If you have not checked out Decoding the Unicorn, if the types of things that I'm saying have resonance for you, I highly, highly encourage you to check out The Life and Legacy of Dag Hammarskjöld. You can buy my book, Decoding the Unicorn, on Amazon.com. And I hope that you check it out. And I hope that you subscribe and you enjoy this podcast very much. I'll see you next time.